Hello, friends. My name is Ashish Chadha. I'm a professor of film media at University of Rhode Island, and I'll be chairing today's session. So this is the third part and the penultimate part of the visiting artist of the semester, Anand Patwardhan. We did 2 screenings of his. We showed his very political and probably his most provocative work in today's context, Ram Ke Naam. And then we also showed his latest film, which is his most personal film, Vasudev Kutumbakam. And today we have this seminar in which Anand will speak, he will lecture us. And then we have 2 respondents, Arindam Dutta from MIT, historian of architecture and a cultural studies historian. And then followed by Arindam will be Rahul Mukherjee. Rahul Mukherjee is a professor of media studies at University of Pennsylvania. So before Anand starts, I've written a few things that I thought it's important to contextualize Anand's visit in the context of our times. So I just want to, it's a long introduction or a shortish, longish introduction on why I think Anand is so important to us as a filmmaker, to me as a filmmaker. So I'm just going to read something and then have Anand come and give us talk. I was first introduced to Anand's work in 1987 as a school student when I saw his searing commentary of the crisis of housing and homelessness in urban India with his film, Bombay Hamara Shahar, a film that dexterously investigates the life of millions of slum dwellers in Bombay, the working class, the lower caste people of the city as they struggle to survive and resist the aggressive policies of the state and urban elites in Bombay. This film had a deep impact in my life as it inspired me to think seriously as a high school student to take up a career as a social activist. And I then eventually did my undergraduate in social work. And Anand's film, Bombay Hamara Shahar, plays a very important role in my own biography. Subsequently, between 91 and 94, while working as an activist for the Narmada Bachao Andolan, I very closely observed Anand as he almost single-handedly made the documentary on the environmental movement called The Narmada Diary. So much so that I even appear briefly in that film. This is a memorable moment of my life as Anand shot me, along with a few other activists, in front of the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay. This was just minutes before I got arrested for the first time in my life. Anand is the most celebrated documentary filmmaker in India, not just because he has won innumerable awards, but most importantly because he inaugurated the world of independent documentary in India. And this is really important. He is the pioneer of what in the history of Indian documentary films are called post-statist films. Prior to his intervention as a filmmaker in 1974, documentary films in India were primarily made by the central government propaganda organization, Films Division. These were statist documentaries exemplified by daring, tedious narrative that not only patronizingly informed its citizens about the generative possibility of chemical fertilizers, the mathematical efficacy of decimal coinage, the democratic emancipation of universal suffrage, but also dictated the intimate sexual life of its citizenry, counseling them of appropriate contraceptive technologies. It is in this world Anand comes. Anand gives birth to the independent activist filmmaker who has become very common in India today, who not only make films that were this is a group of people who not only make films that are devastatingly critical of the state and the contemporary Indian society, moored in classist, casteist, and communal mindset, but this also gave birth to the filmmaker that was singularly independent, producing films with their own finances, not dependent on state and other sources. And this is something really important that I think Anand contributed to the history of Indian documentary, that you could become an independent filmmaker with an independent intellectual framework, and also to financially make films independently. This was not possible before 1974 when Anand came. This was radical independent film in spirit and soul. This was no mean task, because cinema in those days was shot on super expensive celluloid. It was impossible for filmmakers to work without being dependent on state or the logic of market, commercial market. And this is what Anand breaks for us. Also, Anand is one of the first filmmakers in India who introduced the theory of practice of cinema verite, or direct cinema, into Indian cinematic modernity. Cinema verite, or which is how it is known in France, or direct cinema, it was known in America, was a radical style of documentary filmmaking that emerged in France and the US in the 1960s, characterized by handheld camera that captured the spontaneity and the authenticity of real life, providing a sense of mobility and immediacy. These filmmakers attempted at presenting the factual in contrast to the statist propaganda. This was really a radical moment, a radical intervention. There was a clear focus to create cinematic narrative located in the ability of camera to capture the real and to present these cinematic representation as an objective narrative of the people. This is something that you see in almost all of Anand's films. And this begins, I would argue, with him in 1974, when he made his first film, during the midst of emergency. The ideological impetus was to contrast and challenge statist regimes of narration. These films were actively used by local political activists in organizational work and create awareness among students, peasants, and workers in areas where there was conflict. Today, I also think Anand as one of the pioneer essay filmmakers in India. Essay film is a unique genre of cinema that blends documentary and narrative elements with a strong personal voice. His last few films, starting from War and Peace, Jai Bhim, Comrade, and his 4 long magnum opus, Reason, exemplifies this complex style of filmmaking that very few in India have undertaken. I would say there are very, very few essay filmmakers in India. And I would again think Anand is one of the pioneers. There are a couple of other filmmakers that I think they're important, like Money Calls, some of Money Calls documentary could be categorized as essay. Ruchir Joshi, who also makes films in the late 80s, early 90s as an essay filmmaker. But I think Anand is one of the first to really give it a very robust voice in India. With this short kind of conceptual introduction to Anand, I just want to end and give Anand the stage to give his lecture. Thank you. I think you should just sit here. Arindam, Rahul.
Should I just sit?
Or whatever you feel like. No, I think you should stand here, I think, because they should kind of begin.
Okay. Because then you have to bend down to the mic. Okay. Oh, no, I think you can hear it. Everyone can hear everything. Okay, so you have to forgive me because this is something that I wrote and spoke a year ago, because I was at IDFA, the International Documentary Film Festival in Amsterdam, in last year, and that was just after October. It was November, so it was just after October 7th, and it was a yeah. That's okay. Yeah. So actually, in the festival was in turmoil because people were protesting about what had happened on both sides of the fence, and so I wrote this partly in that context. Okay, let me go forward. And I'm not sure what qualifies me to speak on Earth, War, and Cinema. That was the title of the talk. Other than the fact that I have said in the past that the best disseminated films today are often not about issues that we desperately need to think about. it may sound like I'm advocating a prescriptive mode of filmmaking, but this is not what I mean. Cinema is, after all, an intervention. It can at times make a huge difference to the world. This presupposes two things. One, that a film is the outcome of an urgently felt need at the ground level. Two, that there are ears and eyes to receive it and gatekeepers who allow its passage. Earth and war are intimately related issues. We know that post the Industrial Revolution, 50% of the world's fossil fuels, accumulated over millions of years, have been used up in less than 150 years. We know that the burning of this fuel is causing what is probably irreversible climate change, with melting ice caps, flooding, drought, destruction of forests, to name just a few of the present and impending disasters. The reliance on chemical agriculture, the reliance on plastics, which are after all another oil product, are just a few of the corollaries. While these are man-made disasters, they are not always intentional disasters, but byproducts of our hubristic attempt to improve our lifestyle through a supposed mastery over nature. War, on the other hand, is an intentional disaster. Human beings pre-plan the destruction of other humans by manufacturing ever more sophisticated weapons of destruction, and then market these to clients ever willing to buy and use them. In 1945, Dwight Eisenhower was a US military commander when the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by atomic weapons. He rose to be president. In 1961, just before he left office, he made a startling speech that described his darkest fears of where the USA and the world was headed. He coined the term military-industrial complex to describe the ever-growing power of a conglomerate of public and private forces and politicians connected to the defense industry who exert a stranglehold on the political economy of the world. In the 62 years after this speech, apart from hundreds of small and medium wars in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, the world has seen protracted war in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, and now in Gaza. The rationale for war varies from fighting communism to containing Islamic fundamentalism, but clearly an all-powerful arms industry needs perpetual war to maintain profits. Perpetual war needs perpetual enemies or renewable and serially created enemies. When enemies don't exist, they can be created. James Bond movies almost perfectly map the routinely changing nature of the world's arch enemies, from communists to Islamists. In fact, for a while, James Bond befriended Islamists during an interlude when Islamists had become allies against communists. When no other enemies exist, there are always rogue elements ready to oblige. The USA alone manufactures over 40% of the world's armaments, often selling to both sides of a given conflict. Its market is internal as well as external. No matter how many school children are slaughtered by mentally disturbed men bearing assault rifles, the National Rifle Association ensures that guns remain easy to acquire and the right to bear arms remains enshrined in the US Constitution. This international war and violence industry could not have continued its manic growth if it was not accompanied by an ideological superstructure. For centuries, literature and art did the job. Today it is done by cinema and TV. Human beings will perhaps always be morbidly fascinated by violence and death, just as they are ever fascinated by sexuality. But the equation of sex with violence is a cultural legacy that needs deconstruction as urgently as ideas of a just war and ideas of revenge. Let us examine these two ideas. Most humans only get up the nerve to go into battle when convinced that their cause is just or necessary. Religion is the most common method of creating conviction, and most wars in history have been fought in the name of God. After the dawn of the nation state, wars came to be fought in the name of country, but God still fortified both sides of these wars. For the combatants on the ground, every war has to be seen as a just war. Mercenaries are an exception. They have no cause to fight for, but like the arms dealers at the top of the ladder, they do it for the money. The military-industrial complex has already ensured that jobs are hard to find except in the industry that promotes death and destruction. Even when a particular war is actually just or necessary, as World War II became after the emergence of Hitler, the need for vengeance ensures greater destruction than is necessary to end the war. The obliteration of the German city of Dresden was revenge for the bombing of London. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were payback for Pearl Harbor. Today in Gaza, we are witnessing the completely disproportionate massacre of Palestinians as payback for the actions of Hamas on October 7. No one asks to know who created Hamas, just as they don't want to know who created Osama bin Laden or ISIS, the Islamic State. This is my beef with the film and TV industry. It is mostly a willing or unwitting part of the dominant economic and political force in the world, the military-industrial complex. If a few people speak out, they are either silenced by overt censorship, as in the case of whistleblowers like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, or assassinated, as was the weapons inspector David Kelly, the man who in 2003 dared to tell Tony Blair's UK that the need to invade Iraq was sexed up. Not only was Kelly murdered for blowing the whistle on Blair and Bush, but we are asked to believe that a man would walk all the way to a public park to slit his arteries rather than do it in the privacy of his own home. I'm not saying that no one has ever made documentaries or fiction films about these issues, but that these stories are rarely disseminated widely enough to impact the consciousness of the world. Occasionally, a story that critiques destruction does become a blockbuster, like Oppenheimer did. But even here, you can see the censors at play, either official or commercial. We learn that J.R. Oppenheimer, a Jewish scientist who was lionized for creating the first atom bomb, then fell from grace when he had a change of heart and opposed the making of the hydrogen bomb. The film revolves around the tragic figure of Oppenheimer without emphasizing the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whose obliteration was, in reality, undeniably unnecessary. Kai Bird, who co-wrote the book on which the Oppenheimer film is based, had been categorical about this needless mayhem 24 years ago when I interviewed him while making our anti-nuclear documentary War and Peace. Kai pointed out that before the atom bombs were dropped, the USA had decoded Japanese telegrams and learned that Japan was about to surrender. Many Jewish and other scientists who had joined the race to make the atom bomb before Hitler could, petitioned the US president to rethink the idea of bombing Japan. The petition never reached F.D. Roosevelt before he died. Kai Bird also pointed out that Americans were never shown close-ups of what the atom bomb had done to people on the ground, but were merely shown the mushroom cloud from afar and long shots of the city in ruins. Indeed, footage from Ground Zero, shot by a Japanese camera crew in 1945, was kept secretly in American vaults before being rediscovered decades later. In 1995, Kybird was part of a research team that was preparing to mount an exhibition at the Smithsonian Museum, tasked with commemorating 50 years of the bomb. This exhibition was censored and sanitized, and neither Republicans nor Democrats on Capitol Hill stood up for free speech. The strategy of sanitizing war has always been followed. The two Gulf wars, Afghanistan and the present war on Palestine, all come to our screens primarily as video games. Needless to add that video games themselves around the world specialize in war games. If well-meaning fiction films like Oppenheimer tell half-truths, it does not mean that well-intentioned documentaries always tell the full truth. I remember seeing Meeting Gorbachev by Werner Herzog at IDFA, the International Documentary Festival in Amsterdam, 5 years ago. Herzog obviously deeply admired Gorbachev that is, the last leader of the Soviet Union, and the film is testimony to how Gorby helped end the Cold War by making deep cuts in the Soviet military and nuclear arsenal. What the film fails to tell us is that President Ronald Reagan never met Gorby halfway. Even as the Berlin Wall came down and treaties were signed bringing widespread hope for a new era of peace, the USA opened up a new frontier with Star Wars, escalating the arms race into outer space. Gorby was toppled by a drunken Boris Yeltsin, supported by the West, and then replaced by Vladimir Putin, who in time revived Russian belligerence with the help of crony oligarchs. As long as the military-industrial complex rules the world, no one is allowed to stop the war machine. The link between earth and war is often hidden from public discourse. Is it not possible, if not probable, that the ethnic cleansing of Gaza has something to do with the discovery of oil and natural gas there and the billions of dollars waiting to be made? An Indian billionaire, Narendra Modi's close friend, Gautam Adani, is already building a port in Israel, and Israel also plans to build a new sea passage, a hugely lucrative rival to the Suez Canal. War apart, no one is allowed to stop the development machine that is eating up the planet's resources in the name of speed and comfort. One man who tilted against the machine by calling for organic, decentralized, and artisanal development rather than unbridled urbanization and industrialization was Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi is perhaps synonymous with the very idea of peace and nonviolence, but Gandhi, unlike warmongers like Henry Kissinger and a hapless President Barack Obama, never won the Nobel Peace Prize. One reason may lie in what Gandhi said in 1938, even as Western powers brainstormed to create Israel, driven by the guilt of having allowed Hitler's genocide, but also by the need to have a super ally to police the oil-rich Middle East. I quote from Gandhi, writing in his mouthpiece, The Harijan, in 1938. My sympathies are all with the Jews. They have been the untouchables of Christianity. The parallel between their treatment by Christians and the treatment of untouchables by the Hindus is very close. Religious sanction has been invoked in both cases for the justification of the inhuman treatment meted out to them. But my sympathy does not blind me to the requirements of justice. The cry for the national home for the Jews does not much appeal to me. The sanction for it sought in the Bible and the tenacity with which the Jews have hankered after return to Palestine. Why should they not, like other peoples on the earth, make that country their home where they are born and where they earn their livelihood? Palestine belongs to the Arabs in the same sense that England belongs to the English or France to the French. It is wrong and inhuman to impose the Jews on the Arabs. What is going on in Palestine today cannot be justified by any moral code of conduct. The mandates have no sanction but that of the last war. Surely it would be a crime against humanity to reduce the proud Arabs so that Palestine can be restored to the Jews, partly or wholly, as their national home. The nobler course would be to insist on a just treatment of the Jews wherever they are born and bred. I will not end with this Gandhi quote from 85 years ago. It is more realistic to conclude with a recent report by arms industry executives from Raytheon Corporation and General Dynamics, two of America's largest defense contractors, who told their investors that Israel's war on Gaza will be good for business. One executive predicting that its recent fourfold increase in artillery production would not be enough to meet additional demand. Let me not be misunderstood. Today, Israel exists and so does Palestine. It is unrealistic to wish either away until such time as people learn to accept each other as human beings with equal rights. But in the interim, the world must not sit back and watch an ongoing genocide as it did during the years of Hitler's rise to power. We must act collectively to not only end global bloodshed, but to find equitable, peaceful solutions. Peace we need now, but justice must follow, for without it, peace cannot sustain. For this to begin to happen, all those who make and sell weapons and promote the hatred that makes them profitable must be defanged physically and ideologically. Such a cultural revolution can begin only when cinema, TV, and social media break free from the ideological and physical shackles of the military-industrial complex. Okay, so that's the end of my talk, but...
So I would like to invite Arindam Dutta. Arindam Dutta is a professor of architectural theory and history in the History Theory Criticism program in Architectural and Art History at MIT. Dutta has been the recipient of Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, the Getty Fellowship, in addition to numerous research grants and awards. He is the author of Bureaucracy of Beauty, Design in the Age of Its Global Reproducibility, from Routledge in 2007, which is a wide-ranging work of cultural theory that connects literary studies, postcoloniality, the history of architectural and design, and the history and present of empire. He's also the editor of a Second Modernism, Architecture, MIT, and Techno-Social Moment on the post-war conjuncture of architectural thought, linguistic and system theories. Right now, he's working on the social and cultural history of Sehmat collective, which is one of the most influential art collective based in Delhi, that has consistently taken stances against threats of religious fundamentalism and sectarianism in India. Arindam.
Thank you, Ashish. This is working. Okay. I'm sorry, Anand, I haven't seen your later films, but I remember, like Ashish, the one that I did see is very deeply etched in my mind. As we were talking earlier, I watched this in March 1993. These dates are, sort of indelible, right? Those years particularly. It was literally 4 months after the Babri Masjid had been demolished. And I grew up in Ahmedabad, despite my very Bengali-looking name. And I grew up in the constituency which has successively returned L.K. Advani, then Narendra Modi and Amit Shah to parliament over the last 30, 40 years. So seeing that film at that time, of course, was sort of a revelation. And many, I think it's fair to say that until 1990, and this is also true of the Sehmat people, that they didn't quite anticipate sort of this wave of religious activism that would sort of envelop India from there on. And so in that sense, Anand was, I think, prescient and almost walking along with them for this long journey that saw riots being, triggered all, in sort of on the penumbra of the Rath Yatra itself. This was the first Rath Yatra of 1990, which was stopped in Samastipur in Bihar. But the Rath Yatra itself was so well managed that no riots were allowed to happen in the vicinity of the Yatra itself. I guess, you know, I have a few questions to Anand. And before, again, we were talking about some of these issues. And Anand brought up the question of facts, that on some level, the cinema verite that you mentioned, I mean, it lays its claim to credence based on a certain relationship to fact, or a certain relationship to truth, and however one defines that. I consider myself a historian, and we have similar kinds of predicaments that appear in terms of our relationship to truth and what one construes as facts and what happens. I mean, you know, what is the narrative here? I remember the one striking image that sticks in my brain, and I mean, I've watched Ram Ke Naam since, so every time I watch it, it's sort of, that's the one scene that really hits me, is the scene at the end when there's this blind man crossing that bridge, right, trying to look for this the Ram Janmabhoomi. And before this, we know that, you know, there's been gunfire and people have been, you know, so there's this kind of right in the middle of this sort of civil warfare, which has been ongoing in India since, like, this blind man somehow makes it past the police. And we're left with the impression that perhaps this is the truly religious person, or the properly religious person. In other words, the relationship to truth of this religious kind is one who cannot see. This is a very archaic image. I mean, we know any number, I mean, Greek philosophy, sort of blind prophets who speak the truth. I mean, you know, so there's a whole, but in some ways we can also link it to Nirgun philosophy or Protestantism, where, you know, all the sort of positive material symbolisms of religion are seen as somehow fake, and the true devout, the true believer, is he who understands God in his soul, etc. And so there is this kind of disbelief of symbols, but with it, perhaps, with the expression of this blind person, perhaps even a disbelief of vision, which is sort of begs the question of what cinema verite does in its depiction of what can only be visual information, right? So I would venture that what struck me about Ram Ke Naam and why it was so effective was not because it was carrying information that was hidden from me. As I said, I grew up in this particular constituency. All my friends were like that, and I was friends with them. But the way in which Anand literally, as I saw the film, sort of walked with these people, and there's this kind of casual snippets, people sort of saying things, and you know, and that's captured on cinema. But it's a particular kind of recapitulation of time on this yatra that's not just, in fact, the hectic, frantic moment of the yatra is never fully sort of shown. It's only like in its aftermath, what's left behind, or people ahead of it. So there's this kind of peculiar play of time that sort of builds the ambiance of what this moment is and what it means culturally. Politically, we could read what was happening in the newspapers, but the cinema was, the film was telling us about something else that would work. And I'm still, you know, we can still discuss in that sense what exactly it was telling us, but it was informative in a very different way. That was not information, right? I ask this because even in this case, you used Kai Bard's example that perhaps one of the ways in which people in America were desensitized to, let's say, Hiroshima and Nagasaki was that there were no close-up images. I question if, you know, close-up images are the answer. Or what close-up images may or may not actually achieve or do. Vietnam was a good example, which was sort of followed up, and there the military got a lot smarter. It was not just the military. I mean, they actually had commanders who were trained in the philosophy of ethics of killing, and we could argue that the Bhagavad Gita is a book on the ethics of killing. It's a religious text. It's sort of a moral text. There was this wonderful TV show in the 80s. I forget what was this TV journalist, very later became important with CNN, Peter something, and there was a face-off between quote-unquote embedded journalists who were going into the villages before the commando teams were sent into North Vietnam, and the military. And the real question was, how much should the news teams reveal? And in revealing too much, were they sort of giving away the American military's plans, or so that was the nature of the relationship of the visual between what is censored and what is not. And of course, the journalists had rights in this country of First Amendment, so they, the military could not censor anything, but it was made very clear that this standard of embedded journalism that is sort of showing war in its most horrific effects is being sort of wholly circumscribed by a kind of strategic some kind of strategic vision of how the war would be conducted, which included within it a certain picturization of human rights discourse, right? Anand, Ashish, you will remember that you're talking about state documentary, and think of state TV, and you were talking about how many of your movies, how many of your films have been shown on TV, like national TV?
In India?
Yeah?
6 after 7 court cases.
I see. But if you remember that cable TV, cable TV came to India precisely during the first Gulf War, when CNN also built its business model on sort of following these, there was the cruise missile which had a camera on its tip, and you could see it, and that's the kind of snuff video shot that we saw in this last film. I can think of this picture of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, this most famous snuff video shot where they're watching Osama bin Laden being killed, and there's that video of them. And CNN was first broadcast in 5-star hotels in Delhi and Bombay to sort of entertain foreigners who the only people who stayed in 5-star hotels at that time. And then the cable operators caught on to that, and then they sort of smuggled these channels to the city outside, and that sort of broke the market, so to speak. But in a sense, it was precisely this kind of pornographic visualization of war that brought on a quote-unquote a freedom of information doctrine into the Indian mediatic universe, if you like. So there are some paradoxes here that I don't yet know how to solve. I think of the work of Tom Keenan, the philosopher, who looked very carefully at media images of African famines, and particularly the Serbian War. And until that point, journalistic doctrine very much sort of operated on one sort of cardinal principle, and this is as true of Vietnam coverage as well, is that if you show the truth, we are going to go take the picture. And if you show the picture will be carried to the audiences in real time, and that's going to sort of, affect the conscience of millions, and somehow that will bring along some kind of revolution or transformation in the way people think about these events, and ergo that will be effective as a way of protesting the war. And Keenan sort of argues that that wasn't true. It didn't. None of that actually held. It turns out that media sits alongside, and I think Anand is making that point. it sits alongside war that is incredibly and more visual. I mean, and now we get it on tweets and WhatsApp, and people who in India who are lynch mobs are filming themselves and sharing their videos, etc. So that, I mean, you don't need journalists; they'll do it for themselves, etc. So my question, the sort of, it's not one question. I'm sure it's many, and I'm not sure that we can truly arrive at an answer. But I think I would like Anand to speak a little bit about how sort of the camera, develops a relationship to truth as he sees it, or at least his camera. And your view, and I don't mean just the camera, it's clearly film is much more than just shooting something. It's about constructing a scene, it's about editing, it's about voiceover, it's about many, many things. It's about the building of time, as I suggested, which is what Ram Ke Naam was for me. So how do you think about these problems?
So,
Anand, let's just get Rahul, and then you can
Maybe
speak.
Anand can answer. Maybe.
I might lose my train of thought.
Okay.
I think,
I won't take long. Firstly, I think that describing my film as cinema verite is incorrect, because there are elements of cinema verite in the film. There are times when the camera is just observing, and that you could probably call cinema verite. It would be. If there for a long stretch, if there's no real intervention by the filmmaker, but just observing what is happening, that is cinema verite. I mean, cinema verite was actually begun by people who were fairly apolitical, in the sense that Richard Leacock and people, it was like the concept was fly on the wall. You just put your camera and you just observe what's happening. You don't get into it. But my films are almost never just observing. They are interventionists. There are elements of cinema verite in them, but there's intervention happening quite frequently. So the point of view of the filmmaker is never hidden from the audience, even while observing and saying, see, because I'm actually always building a case. I'm like a lawyer in a courtroom. I'm saying, here's the evidence. This happened, this happened, this happened. You make up your mind. So the audience is the judge looking at the evidence. So the evidence part of it can be cinema verite, but there's an argument being made all the time. And then the other point that you made about, in fact, you were arguing almost the opposite of what I was saying, in the sense that I was saying that the images of horror created by the perpetrator are hidden to the perpetrator's audience, so that the perpetrator can continue. So whether it's the Vietnam War actually was the time when they didn't succeed in hiding the image too well, because in those days they allowed these images to come home, and that's what created an anti-war movement in America that actually effectively, eventually ended the war, because there was groundswell of public opinion. The universities were on strike across the country. I was here at that time in Brandeis University. Berkeley University and Brandeis coordinated the anti-war effort, and effectively in a few years we actually shut the war down. We actually, because these movements were so strong, the presidential elections were dependent on who was supporting the war and who would be seen as a peace candidate. All that made the military-industrial complex actually understand that we shouldn't show all these images in its raw form. And then in the first Gulf War, the second, and then the Iraq War, and all that, you saw the war as a video game, where you see tracer bullets going from here, or you see bombs exploding, but you never see the close-ups. For the close-ups, and even in what's happening in Palestine right now, it's only those who watch Al Jazeera that understand what is going on, because no one else in America, not even CNN, nobody is showing the stuff that is actually happening. And I'm in my hotel room here in the last few days, and I've flipped channel after channel, and they're like, all of them are Fox channel. There's not even CNN on my TV feed. That's probably not true for all of you. You get lots of different channels, and maybe a glimpse of what's happening in Palestine. But no, it's not an accident that there is no huge groundswell of opinion in the world that says, shut this down. You can't let it go on. So I'm saying that not showing the effects of brutal war is actually, the argument you're making is about visual pornography, about showing too much. I've heard that argument before. Sometimes it was applied even to my filmmaking. There were people in Delhi who said, oh, why are you showing the close-up of dead bodies? That's visual pornography. So the point is that you have to be able to distinguish between when violence is shown for entertainment purposes and when violence is shown because you are fighting against that violence. But not showing it and then thinking that you're a good guy because you didn't show any violence, you're allowing the real violence to take place.
Thanks, Anand. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask our second respondent. No, let me just introduce you. You're going to sit here?
No, that's fine.
Okay, yeah. So the second respondent is Rahul Mukherjee, who is an associate professor of television and new media, and associate professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. He has a PhD from University of California, Santa Barbara, and has been at Cornell University Society for Humanities as the Atkinson Center for Sustainable Future Fellow. He is the author of Radiant Infrastructure, Media, Environment, and Cultures of Uncertainty, Duke University Press. A book which involves mediation of debate controversies related to radiation-emitting technologies such as cell phone antennas and nuclear reactors. Drawing on conceptual lenses of cultural studies, media theory, and science studies, he has written on database management system, advising cultures of mobile telephony, Bollywood thriller, chronic toxicities related to chemical disasters, Bhopal, and development discourses, and also translocal documentaries. Rahul.
Thanks, Ashish. And I did receive Anand's essay a few days before, so I do have some prepared comments, but I want to try to extemporize at times as well. This opportunity to respond to an essay by Anand also makes me chuckle, for I've noticed layers of the essay film in Patwardhan's documentaries before. There are fragments. Not all his films are essay films, I want to be also saying, but there are fragments. The essay no longer is just literary, for it has found various modes of expression across media, including films. My colleague at Penn Cinema, Timothy Corrigan, writes insightfully about the essay films of Chris Marker and Trin Minha. Rather than definitive statements, the essay, according to Corrigan, stresses the explorative and the contingent and a fusing of subjective points into public life, something that I remember very much to be the case in the opening narration sequence of Anand Patwardhan's film about the build-up of bomb cultures in India and Pakistan in the context of the world's arms race, and the film you've referenced, Jang Aur Aman, War and Peace. The film opens up with scenes of the assassination and funeral of Mahatma Gandhi, as Patwardhan narrates how the grief of Gandhi's passing away was transmitted to him through his parents and relatives who were immersed in the independence struggle. Patwardhan then goes on to narrate the slow fall of Nehruvian idealism, the quest of various countries across the world to join the nuclear club, the destructive effects of nuclear tests on air, water, and soil, and the rise of Hindutva forces in India, leading to a condition where around the turn of the century, say 1998, quote, nuclear nationalism was in the air. Patwardhan ends with a line, the memory of one who opposed the bomb on moral grounds had begun to fade. This opening essayistic fragment in Jang Aur Aman sets up in my reading of this remarkable documentary a set of encounters between an individual subject's grief, ethics, and values and the wider public sphere. the documentarian is kind of thinking out loud, something that Anand continues to do with the essay today, which we just heard, Earth War Cinema. In a way, the essayistic inheres in some of Patwardhan's documentaries, particularly when he's very personal. In some ways, I think the personal then sort of, in some ways, fuses with the political. And he's continuing the public dialogue he has started a while back about the connections between across Earth, war, and cinema. Earth and war are intimately related, and some might even say industrial pollution is a war on Earth, the decay and detritus in the wake of fossil fuel extractions and uranium mining and nuclear meltdowns and deforestations and chemical agriculture. That said, for Patwardhan, war has a specificity in not only its human-madeness, but also in its intentionality, deliberateness, part of the military-industrial complex, to which one might add cinema, military-industrial complex, somewhere in the vein of political scientist James Derridian's claim. So we now have the formulation Earth War Cinema. Hollywood and Bollywood have gone to war on several occasions, and one can extend Anand's point to argue that the connection between Earth War Cinema is not just representational, but also deeply material, embedded, embodied, what Paul Wheeler would have called the logistics of perception. The tests of atomic weapons spilling radiation were accompanied by the capture of their spectacular violence through films, as hundreds of Hollywood photographers and filmmakers were brought in to shoot these nuclear test films in Bikini Atoll and other Pacific islands. That the test grounds for such atomic testing were the Pacific islands already suggests how Earth as land is imbricated in colonial takeovers. That to slightly inflect Max Liberace, war's pollution is as much about environmental damage as it is about colonial land and water relations. As Elizabeth Delaure notes, quote, this connection between nuclear radiation and photography is close and historic. Participants in the tests were required to wear film badges that would fog when safe radiation levels were exceeded, replicating the behavior of the 19th century photographic plates that led to the discovery of radioactivity itself. So this is a line of flight from your essay and provocation to think of cinema and media in relationship to Earth and war, not only representationally, but also at the level of the apparatus or the technology itself. It's not just that certain mainstream cinematic and mediatic representations of war have resulted in a certain kind of apathy for environmental destruction and human suffering that they have, but it is also the case that technologies of cinema and technologies of war are entangled, even co-constitutive of war on nature. Patwardhan notes that the narrative tropes of Hollywood cinema often seem to privilege the individual over the collective, the tragedy of the individual over the collective. I agree, but also would add that it just depends on what the figure is. For a while, the figure of the whistleblower was a theme, so I want to discuss a little bit of that. So, the experiences of an actual nuclear worker, Karen Silkwood, are the focus of the 1983 fictional film Silkwood by Mike Nichols. Silkwood worked in the Kerr-McGee nuclear plant in Oklahoma. The film offers close-ups of Karen, played by Meryl Streep, and her friend's everyday work of manufacturing plutonium pellets to be used in the reactors at Hanford, Washington. The film not only delves into the difficult working conditions and the exhausting hours of work and the extra shifts that laborers have to endure, but also explores the complexities of Karen's willingness to join the workers' union and later to espouse the role of a whistleblower when she decides to share information with a New York Times reporter regarding malpractices in the nuclear facility. But she meets a car accident or a certain kind of... finally, the leak does not quite happen. And this was something that a bunch of other films around this time, another famous one was China Syndrome, also mentioned. So this was around the mid-70s. The act of whistleblowing had gained a lot of attention in the US mainstream media and politics, thanks to the popularization of the term whistleblower by Ralph Nader and the public praise of Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked top-secret Pentagon papers about the US intervention in Vietnam. The whistleblowers in both China Syndrome and Silkwood do not fully succeed in leaking secrets via journalists about the organizations they work for to the wider public. Today there are documentaries made about Ed Snowden by Laura Poitras, like Citizen4, as Anand during his talk mentioned, but they remain very much independent documentaries about whistleblowers that do not circulate through dominant Hollywood distribution channels. It seems the NSA, powerful governments, do not suffer legitimacy crises. Nothing seems to affect their legitimacy of continuing to dominate geopolitics. What these powerful world powers powerful world powers, okay, have not been able to control our circulation of TikTok videos from war zones as yet. And I was curious in some ways on your sort of long terms, like in ways of trying to distribute your films through the state broadcasters, if the move to the music video is partly to also think about the distribution possibly as documentarians are also in some ways becoming content creators and have their YouTube channels. So in some ways the mode of what circulates today would be something interesting to hear you as well. I realize that I've been offering examples from films about nuclear reactors, but what we are really discussing are also nuclear weapons, preoccupation in Anand's films and this talk as well. However, nuclear reactors, at least their upkeep, continues to be war by other means. What Anand says as, quote, war apart, no one is allowed to stop the development machine that is eating up the planet's resources in the name of speed and comfort. This might also be called war by other means, war on flagrantly depleting resources, war on the environment. Consider this case. The nuclear reactors in France run providing electricity to many French citizens because of the uranium mined in Arlit, Niger, a former colony of France. And in the uneven terms of this uranium trade between France and Niger gesture to the continuation of the colonial legacies of extraction in post-colonial times. This is something painstakingly brought out by Idrissa Morakapai in his observational documentary Arlit Désume Paris, Arlit Second Paris. The French parastatal organization that carried this mining out for the longest time, Areva, was setting up the world's largest nuclear reactors in Jaitapur, Maharashtra by the Arabian Sea. This is global political economy supported by an avalanche of semiotic economy. The nuclear reactor and its infrastructures of production can be weaponized into a nuclear weapon, as Svetlana Matvienko notes in her discussion of the recent Russian occupation of the Chernobyl atomic power plant in Ukraine. This kind of disturbing of the exclusion zone of a reactor that has already had a meltdown is an example of an environmental threat that may not even recognize national borders. Along with targeted airstrikes on the infrastructure of Ukrainian cities, one of the first events of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was the February 24 occupation of the nuclear reactor in Chernobyl with its sort of meltdown in the late 1980s, part of a longer nuclear colonialism, as some would say, practiced by the USSR. This is war as ecocide, and one finds instances with different chemical agents elsewhere in Vietnam and Palestine. To get back to nuclear testing and nuclear weapons, it continues to be striking how little is shown about the reality of nuclear weapons and testing sites, how little is understood about the people who are affected by testing in those sites and beyond, the downwinder bodies, whether in Nuevo Mexico after the Trinity tests or those in Ketulai after the Pokhran tests in India. Stephen Burunda calls the Trinity tests not atomic tests, but as atomic attack, part of atomic coloniality, and discusses the need of a downwind media, the task of which is taken up by the local community activists in the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, TBDC. The TBDC highlights that people unknowingly worked with, ate and drank, and children likely played with contaminated matter after the atomic attack at Trinity. People in other states like Arizona, Utah, and Nevada have been compensated, but not New Mexico. In Anand's film Django Raman, in the course of the film, Patwardhan questions a lawyer in the town of Pokhran, where the tests were conducted, about people suffering from cancer in the nearby village of Ketulai. The lawyer says that he has not heard about any cases and does not believe this could have happened. When Patwardhan asks him whether he has any facts to conclusively prove that no cancer deaths have occurred from the radioactive tests, the lawyer seems to be caught off guard. He then contradicts himself by saying that some cases might have occurred, but nonetheless, the nuclear tests have brought Pokhran and India fame. When he adds that if, for imagination's sake, 10 to 15 people were affected, they do not matter when the country's fame is at stake. He ends up smiling apologetically, realizing his own foolishness. This scene has wider ramifications as it points to the apathy of the Indian population, especially the well-off, educated, and purportedly well-informed urban population, about the condition of their own fellow countrymen living in a neglected village. In the next scene, true to his dialectical interweaving of scenes, Patwardhan shows the villagers belonging to the Bishnoi community of Ketulai, complaining about illnesses afflicting animals, cows developing knots in their necks and rabbits completely disappearing, and illnesses affecting humans since 1974 when the first test occurred. The irony should not be lost here. Bishnoi's members of a small religious sect whose founder had forbidden the felling of trees and killing of animal who lived in Ketulai. So the world's first conservationists find themselves as victims of radioactive colonization of the Indian state. What Janga Raman does and what Anand's essay Earth War Cinema does is to argue that to understand the problem of geopolitics and issues of planetarity and planetary damage, we cannot afford to atomize sectors, objects, and agents of geopolitics, because that would forbid us from figuring out the systemic or the ecosystemic character of change, dynamism, and mutability, something that other scholars like Jairus Victor Grove have also mentioned. So I'll just finish quickly. So in this moment of gloom where geopolitics of industrialized war and capitalism, as Jairus Victor Grove has written, is husbandry of global life, has clearly triumphed in selecting life for some and death for others through lethal forces, perhaps stories and ideas by committed documentary filmmakers like Anand Patwardhan still matter, even though they cannot perhaps save us from extinction, us as in human species, other species will still remain. Socially committed filmmakers will continue making films, writing essays to change the world, or perhaps at least to change the way people see, listen, sense, and perceive the world. Somebody will still ask, will have to ask, why this madness, this violence is still unfolding. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Anand, do you want to respond to Rahul, or we should just open up? I think this is Ashutosh.
Let me, in the spirit of a dialogue between art and the social sciences, let me say something about what the social science of violence in various forms is saying as of now. And maybe the Vietnam moment was exceptional, and the anti-war protests that emerged, can you hear me? The anti-war protests that emerged so arrestingly on US campuses and yes, shut down the war, might not have been, and I'm not saying I know for sure, but I'll use some data to suggest, to make some suggestions. So, and the Vietnam point here is might not have been because the grotesque forms of violence and killings were shown, but because there was something in the moment outside. Okay? Why do I say so? So let me begin with lynchings that you referred to. You're right, Indian lynchings that I'm studying also captured the lynching and broadcast it on WhatsApp to hundreds and thousands, etc. Here is the most widely and most deeply studied form of lynching in the social sciences, which is the lynchings of blacks in American
Which was
South.
also mediatized and photographed and etc. Yeah.
I was going to read that.
Yeah.
So, right?
Yeah.
I was going to read what Richard White, a famous historian of that period, wrote about that. So I just read it. It's a 1 minute thing, but it's very, very, very instructive, and says something about what I'm going to come to in the end: demand for violence.
Yeah.
Citizen demand
Exactly.
for violence.
Exactly.
And punishment. Right? Very, very uncomfortable facts for us to recognize. So here is Richard White, the great historian, describing lynchings of blacks in ex-Confederate American South. Yeah, I'm there. I wrote this in a paper I published earlier this year. Lynchings were more than executions. They were public spectacles, even entertainments, that often took place before large crowds. White men tortured black men, dismembering, castrating, and burning them. Photographers memorialized the murders. The photographs turned into postcards sold widely. Far from being a problem for Democrats, the original racists at that time, lynching carried little political costs with their Southern base in elections. It reinforced their standing as a white man's party and defender of Southern home and womanhood. Unquote. Lynchings were popular. In the 18, if you see the data, they begin declining. Lynchings begin declining around 1892-93 when laws excluding blacks have started becoming part of what came to be later known as Jim Crow Southern constitutions, because their state can have a constitution. All ex-Confederate states by 1910 had Jim Crow constitutions in place, excluding blacks. By the 14th and 15th Amendment, though both were inclusionary, 15th Amendment gave adult black males right to vote, and 14th Amendment gave them civic equality and equal citizenship. And 13th, of course, abolished slavery, right? So this is the point about demand for grotesque forms of violence, castration, burning, etc., of the other, right? Okay. Second point. The book that I finished reading recently, and I was on a prize committee, we given her the prize this morning, Sarah Zuckerman-Daly, documents a very remarkable and puzzling phenomenon and explains it. Why is it that after the Civil War ends, in most civil wars, though the victors of civil war are elected in elections, the first election they are elected, and that's not because the citizens did not know what they perpetrated upon them, including deaths, including sexual violence, but they win. And she argues that most citizens, this is a remarkable piece of social science, right? Stunning piece of social science. With data she shows, most citizens did not emphasize justice or punishment of the perpetrators as the first goal. The first goal was who can establish order. This is a Hobbesian argument from the English Civil War, but this is not, Hobbes couldn't measure, we are measuring. This generation can measuring extremely well. Who can establish order so that kids can go to school and I can go to the grocery store and buy the necessities without worrying about being killed?
Yep.
Okay, so let me summarize. I've spoken for too long, but the main point is, relating to the discussion that has taken, the fantastic discussion that has taken place, from which all of us can learn, showing the grotesque forms of violence may not necessarily produce an opposition to it among the citizens or reaction to it. Perhaps there was something very unusual about the moment called Vietnam protests, rather than showing of the grotesque forms in the Vietnam War up in North Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Anand or Arindam? What?
I
You can go ahead.
So and briefly, I will add to that. I've read some of the literature on the black lynchings. Newspapers sold out. They pre-advertised these events and they sold out, and they advertised that they're going to have like photographs to show. So that's absolutely true. Maybe I'm going to find out that I'm the only person in this room, but I don't think the protests killed the Vietnam War. I've sort of slogged my way through Ken Burns' 10-part series on the Vietnam War. It was a very complex process of, certainly, I belong to a university. I keep telling my students, especially after last semester, that do you know that this is one of the few places on the planet where students flew the enemy flag? During a war, it would be unthinkable on pretty much at MIT. So, but despite that, it's a very complex story. I think the message from the message from the Vietnam War was carried by both sides in very different ways. The protesters thought they had stopped it, which is itself a kind of fiction which needs to be looked at. But the military also took away messages, which is like, it was not just that we won't show the grotesqueness of this killing, but it's also our soldiers are coming back, and there was PTSD afterwards. So we want to stop, sort of, no more combat boots on ground. So it actually developed this doctrine of, which was already present in Vietnam, which didn't stop, is high altitude precision bombing. And precision bombing was a kind of, it had a human rights doctrine written into it, because it's like targeted rather than carpet bombing. So you just kill the person you're supposed to kill, as opposed to like the whole population of the city, etc. So it's a far more, so the whole ethics and doctrine of war in relationship to protest, I think, shifted. And I think at this point we do find ourselves, and here I'm in agreement with Anand, but not for the reasons that he states, is that we are undone in our protest because on some level, war has also become very precise and who it targets, and precisely in order to then establish that we are in the right. It's like, we can establish order, all of those things, as we are seeing right now. Like this war that we're seeing in Lebanon and Gaza is yet again being portrayed as the last war. Like we will fix this one and good. We know nothing will be fixed. Things will continue, but the claim is to restore order, right? So that's what and that's the argument, right? Which becomes hard to beat, I think, and the protesters found that out. Last semester, all our campuses were awash with this stuff, and so I don't have any good answers. I think we're all sort of trying to work out our predicament in this situation. Sorry, I spoke too much, but
No, it's fine. So I just wanted to clarify, if I wasn't clear, that I'm not saying that close-ups of violence is going to stop the war. That's not the point I'm making. And the Vietnam War, of course, stopped for many reasons. One of them was that people saw the images, but the other was that American soldiers were coming home dead. Dead bodies were coming home. One of the main reasons that the war stopped was because there was a draft, and there was the elite that was coming home dead. It wasn't blacks and Hispanics immigrants who were sent to fight like they are now, people looking for jobs. It was the actual middle class and the elite. Sometimes even well-to-do people were drafted, and they went to Vietnam and they died there. And that fact itself, actually, we all protested against the draft in those days. In fact, had the draft been in place today, there would probably be fewer wars because rich people would be fighting. Even in India and Pakistan, if you make the elite go to war, it will end soon. They have a working class that they send to war. People, in fact, fight to get into the military and the police because there's no jobs. So poor people are lining up and die in the process of getting recruited because there's so much demand to be in these. They are the only job givers in India right now, is the security forces. So I'm not saying at all that this one act of showing violence actually ends the violence. But I'm saying that it's not enough to just show the violence, but contextualize it. And that's why the point I'm making about Al Jazeera. How many people in America watch Al Jazeera? I don't know if there's a survey on that, huh?
It's not permitted.
It's not
you
permitted.
can watch it on YouTube. Everybody watches it on
You
YouTube.
watch on YouTube because feds have all your numbers and they'll pull up people like me. They'll hold me in JFK. They won't allow me to come in. So be very careful what you say.
What I'm saying is, however they succeed in doing it, they have succeeded in making. And I'm not saying Al Jazeera is wonderful about everything. Al Jazeera also has its blind spots. There are things that they won't talk about. But the point is, if you want to actually figure out what's happening in the world, you have to have multiple sources. So Al Jazeera should have been one of the sources in a democracy that people should have been able to see. just as they can see CNN and see everything else. If people don't watch this, they don't get the point of view at all.
We had it, but they didn't move.
Pardon?
We had.
You had it, and yeah.
No, you.
I'm I just want to get back to these.
So what I'm saying, the point I'm making is not the visual, not just the visual of dead bodies and things like that, but actual an analysis that criticizes what's going on.
I will just take just two, there are 3-4 hands, but I just want to say,
I can talk later.
I just-
At the time I will on this point.
I just have another point which is kind of relates to these images. I'm an anthropologist by training, and over the last few years I've been studying, I do what's called social media ethnography. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, which as you know is so I spend a lot of time I've looked at a lot of trajectory of lynching videos, for instance. And what has happened, and here I think it's an interesting thing, that this is not the Vietnam War era, this is something else, something dramatically different. So I think I think we have to understand that conflating the role of image 40 years ago just doesn't work today, because today the image are circulating in a very insidious manner. Because as Arindam rightly mentioned, that a lot of lynching videos in India, and the thing that I got involved specifically was during the Delhi riots. I was shocked. I mean, for the first time, I come from a partition family. I've seen the 1992 Bombay riots. I was shocked that the narratives that we were hearing in Delhi riots, I could see that. Stabbing, shooting, and killing. And then I started following what was happening to these videos. The videos these images, the objective veracities of the images was being used by all sides of people. They were used by extreme right wing. I think if you know about the Hindutva writing, there's something called the Raitas and the Trads. They were exploiting exactly the same lynching, same videos to construct more audience, whereas the left was using in a different way. So I think the objective nature of the image, of the violent image, does not have the same veracity as it was 40 years ago. And I think that's a very important point. And therefore, what Anand was saying about the contextualizing of the image becomes very important, which is possible, especially if you're making a documentary or a long-form essay. But then what's happening now is that on Twitter, you just have 2 lines and a 3-minute lynching video. It becomes something radically different.
Let me follow up on this. This is very important. And I've been working on this, all right?
Then I think there are 3 hands and...
I'll just take 2 minutes. Yes, contextualization, but it goes in 2 directions, right? And there is something enduring, I think, about what I'm saying. Not simply that social media has changed the context or changed the way things can be done. Nelson Mandela has an article in Time magazine when Time magazine chose Gandhi as the 2nd most important man of the century. Nelson Mandela has a great line there which also goes back to an earlier time, and I'll say what it is. Said in 1961 we gave up our full commitment to non-violence, and we developed a hybrid strategy, and we decided as ANC that violence will be part of our struggle. Why? He asked the question why, and then he answers it. We came to the conclusion that our oppressors think that we, the blacks, are not human beings. They have dehumanized us to such an extent that Gandhi's argument that if the oppressor kills you or wants to kill you and you hit back non-violently, it will produce guilt inside him. But if the oppressor thinks that we are not even human beings, we are animals, then he or she can kill us with abandon, with any sense of guilt. Please note, this question was asked of Gandhi as well. Can you try non-violence against Hitler? Gandhi said no, with some difficulty, and maybe greater difficulty, but yes, it should be tried. And the critique that came was, well, they don't think Jews are human beings.
Exactly.
They can kill with abandon. So let's conclude here. What this context is, I have seen some of the Delhi riot videos. The idea here is Muslims are either second-rate citizens or not Indians, so we can kill with abandon. You otherize them to such an extent that you have dehumanized them. Therefore, killing is fine. This is a theory of violence. This is, that supports this kind of contextualization. Let me stop. I think too much time.
I'll just, there, 1, 2, 3, I'll just go one. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think this will maybe like.
I think, can you introduce yourself and then just take the microphone? Hang on.
Hi, I'm Arnav. I'm a PhD student in the English department. I think this just brings together a little bit of what Ashish, you were saying, and Arindam, your points as well. I hadn't seen the images you didn't see, and I think there's a sort of literal quality to it in a way that I saw while watching it, which is in the sort of age of kind of the social media image and its circulation, you literally don't see that image, right? I mean, so even the filmmaker, you're talking about, the interventionist or the truthful image. Even in that piece where you're putting together found footage, you are not, as a filmmaker, seeing that image either, right? And so I'm wondering whether, what happens now when we're sort of looking at images at 6, 7, 8 degrees of separation, right? What happens to that question of that veracity of that image when all of these images are images we didn't see, in a sense? And the reason I ask this is because it's a larger sort of structural question. You gave this talk at a documentary film festival. I've been currently in the weeds of your master's thesis at McGill because I've been writing about. I've been trying to write about the sort of moment of cultural production in the emergency, and a lot of the references in that thesis I was reading were to the sort of third cinema movement, right, which I feel like has sort of lost its valence today. But in the sense that third cinema was responding to a Hollywood era kind of production, because it was a time in which you screened films, so therefore it brought people into a theater to watch a film and therefore could produce action in some way in this guerrilla sense. Now in this sort of way in which we're watching images increasingly in atomized spaces, right? So how do you sort of see that kind of that political economy view of like, if the mainstream industry is your target here in the talk, right? What is it? Is it the social media documentarian that is then the response to that, or is it the sort of going back to a sort of material image in a sense? Like, I'm just wondering, putting together these threads of social media and this kind of longer historical arc of screenings as well. If you have a sort of sense of where we might go now.
Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing that people look at my thesis that I wrote.
I was just wondering, were you willing to disavow it?
No, I'm not disavowing it, but it was written in late 70s. So I was in my 20s, and it's not. I don't disavow it, but I think that I have moved on from the point of view expressed there to some extent. And you're right that I'm losing my train of thought, but you talked about
Third cinema.
third cinema is okay. I've outgrown it to some extent. The third cinema for me was actually something that I was already practicing. I was very happy that somebody had theorized the fact that I could be out of focus and use bad footage and still get away with it, in the sense of saying that, and I was also learning my craft and I had no money. So basically third cinema is saying, no, these are the battle scars. You're in the fields. Don't try to hide it. Don't try to be perfect. The image doesn't matter as much. And so I was, valorized by the fact that somebody had written about it that way. Yeah.
There's a question. I'll just come to this.
There was a second point that I've forgotten, but I was making.
Yamini, you were saying something.
Yeah, we have- yeah, there we go.
Thank you. Well, two
connected and not so and slightly disconnected. Just one just on this social media imagery and relationship with violence. I think one of the things that social media has done is that it has brought violence into your everyday in a way that it's almost totally normalized. Like it has become norm. It doesn't hit me when I see a video of a car in Lakhimpur that is rolling over human beings, or somebody's head being shot off right in front. It's just there. It's there all the time. And it has become so normalized that images that you would think in the civilized world you wouldn't see in your everyday are now just living with you every day, and you move on because that's the only way that human beings can cope. And actually, I think that is precisely why the role of the interlocutor, who places it in context and forces you to have a conversation with that violence, becomes so important. So actually seeing violent images in the context of a film that asks you whether you think that's okay is even more significant in today's times, when we are just seeing all of this. Each of the images that you presented in those 5 minutes, in different ways and forms, we have seen. Perhaps not as acutely, but we have seen them. Somebody had to put them all together and push you to say, are you okay with this? And I think that's what we are missing in all of this, that is why you need an Anand Patwardhan to place it all together and to force you as a viewer to have a conversation. And the question to ask is, how can we use cinema more effectively for just this, given that there is actually with YouTube so much democratization. Every day there'll be individuals who aren't necessarily artists in their professional lives are able to push you this way. Like, how can we have more of this? There has to be a counter movement, and I think the positive side of social media allows you for that. And what can we do to pursue this? But I had a different question for you, Anand. I was thinking about Ram Ke Naam over the last few days when we watched it on Tuesday, and there was something very important about watching the film of 30 years ago in today's moment, because I get, the one thing that struck me again and again in the conversations that what people were saying through the film, it was like the ordinary Indian was still, we were all having a conversation with ourselves about whether this is okay. And it was very visible. The ideologue was the ideologue, but the average person who is participating, observing, affected by the whole movement is asking, is wondering. There is enough, there's a lot of conversation around why this should happen in the first place, that we should all find ways to live in harmony. There are many temples in Ayodhya. And then I was thinking too, the last few times I've been in UP, and especially, when Ashu was there too, when we went in May, just after the consecration of the temple, and everyone, more or less, just shrugged their shoulders and said, Mandir to banna hi tha, that had to happen. And now that it's done, can we please move on? And so it's like we just stopped having that conversation. What you captured and reminded us, which was so important, is that this wasn't a done deal. It was a conversation. There was a movement, and there could have been a counter mobilization that never occurred. And now it feels like it's a done deal. And I was wondering, as you reflect on this, when you think back to all the individuals that you spoke with, could you have thought that 30 years later it would be such a done deal? I just wanted your reflections on that.
I actually remembered what I wanted to respond to you when you were asking, and that is about the difference between how cinema was in the time when I began filming, when we would show the films, or we had our own projectors and take the projector and lug the big reels of film and then show the film and have a discussion with the audience afterwards. So that whole process was a package. It was not just watching a film. It was watching the film, having a discussion with an audience, and that's completely different from people who watch their films on their little TV monitors, or even on, a lot of people watch films on phone, on the tiny screen. And that's the only connection they have to cinema. So that's completely different. So an isolated exercise. And so they are, I think you're right that the maybe call it the power to change or the power to start a conversation is diminished by the fact that people are in their bubbles watching, and you're not able to talk back to the screen. Definitely, that's a huge change. The other thing that I wanted to talk about violence and the difference between we have to make a distinction between the use of violence as entertainment and the depiction of violence, say in a documentary that is critiquing the violence. And I think that the documentary or fiction that critiques the violence is something that I think is valuable today. But the amazing amount of violence that is mandatory almost in commercial cinema, whether in India or in Hollywood, it's there all the time. Anything. I mean, it's so mindless. I mean, I can't even believe how idiotic people are that they wouldn't watch Avengers and all of this crap that comes out, these Marvel comic stuff, which we're starting to do in India as well. The film RRR won an Oscar. RRR is a Marvel comic version. I mean, it's not even history; it's completely distorted history. Has anybody seen RRR?
I left at the midpoint.
No, but you must watch it as a sociological exercise.
I will watch
So,
it as a political scientist.
yeah, because the film becomes Hindutva propaganda completely. It's shocking, and then the people in America didn't even understand that that's what was being done to them. They in that whole film, the freedom struggle was won not by non-violent Mahatma Gandhi is nowhere in the picture at all. It was won by people with machine guns who shot all the British. Yeah, so.
I'll watch it.
Can I
Very hard to take it.
So can I very quickly follow up from Yamini's question? And Anand, you had said, that you see your films as building a case. So this is kind of a juristic proposition. You mentioned the figure of the lawyer. So can I invite you?
I do that because I act in real life also. I've had to be a lawyer sort of because every one of my films went to court and we went to.
So may I ask you to expand a little bit about how that actually plays out in your choices as a filmmaker? Your choice of technique, editing, what do you look for? Just to give us a sense of your craft.
No, I don't think, because it differs from film to film and issue to issue, but I am always imagining myself as the audience. And I'm not making a film targeting one particular group of people or the other. I'm targeting, say, if I was watching, what would I get out of it? And so the arguments that I'm putting together are arguments that make sense to me in that sense, I don't know if I'm explaining it properly.
But if you're shooting something and you find this dialogue useful, this person saying this is more interesting than the other, what would have you observed yourself sort of making certain kind of, is there a pattern in your choices that you've observed yourself making?
There are lots of patterns that emerge if you watch the whole body of films together, then you will get the pattern. But I'm not self-conscious as a filmmaker in the sense that I'm not theoretical at all. I'm not looking at, even though you talk about the third cinema, but that, as I pointed out, third cinema was only telling me it's okay to do what you're doing. It's not that I learned how to do it from reading third cinema.
Let's have,
Thank you, Anand. I have a comment and a question. Comment is that I agree with the draft being one of the reasons because I grew up in medicine in the era where the AIDS was initial.
Yeah.
And as long as it was contained in Africa's and with gay population, nobody wanted to talk about it. The moment it became mainstream, we got funding, NIH, and so on and so forth, and now here we are, it's a common. So my question to you and the panel, who obviously reads a lot about journalism, or at least that context, is that if you look at Robert Capa or Henri Cartier-Bresson, that generation of photojournalists, the ethics and values of that journalism era, where you couldn't touch anything. And then Steve McCurry, who was in Iraq, and most of the images that we see of Iraq in photojournalism are from his camera. And then maybe 5 years ago, it came out that he heavily edits the pictures, and it was a huge hue and cry. So the question, academic question here, is that if you were to teach, or anyone was to teach in photojournalism class, outside of people who take YouTube videos and upload it on their own, I'm talking about professional photojournalists who people should have confidence in their work. How does that photojournalist disentangles himself or herself from their personal context of the thing, and truly, without an op-ed, relays the information to the public for them to truly read not between the lines, but truly read what it is?
So I think the search for truth in the abstract is impossible. In the sense, there's no such thing as objective reporting. I'm going to carry my baggage to every situation. And that baggage, I think I have to be honest about my baggage. It's there. But I'm not hiding that baggage. I'm not hiding my bias. Pretending that you are recording some objective reality is the problem, because there's no such thing. Not BBC, not anybody is objective. They're carrying their own baggage, and they report. When I film something, I choose where to put my camera. I could have shot here, but I'm shooting here. That's one level of choice. I choose how long to continue the interview if I'm doing an interview, when to cut it off, and later I edit it. So I'm making choices all the time, but I'm making choices based on actuality rather than reenacted or recreated material. That's one thing. The other thing is that there's a huge difference between photojournalism and audiovisual, because the image by itself doesn't speak. I mean, it speaks evocatively, but you're not giving voice to the people that you have filmed. So they become the object of your photograph. The object doesn't speak. The object, you don't hear from that, the person in the picture doesn't talk. So that's quite different from, I'm not saying you can't manipulate, you can make audiovisuals which are telling lies using reality material, but even in a one-to-one thing, to have people talk back is already an exercise in democracy. The fact that you are carrying the image and voice of people from one place to another. I mean, when I made, for instance, even Bombay Our City, which was about the homeless in Bombay, so I filmed in amongst the homeless a lot, but I also filmed the elite who thought that they were trash, who thought they were, that it's only, they were lazy, they were unintelligent, that's why they were where they were on the footpath. So the fact that I could carry the image of the people who were homeless into the homes of the people who felt like that was a dialogue that was artificially happening through the film. And the other way around, the voices of the elite, when we showed it in the slums, was also communicating. It was a kind of cross-fertilization of ideas, which doesn't happen exactly the same way if it's photographs that cannot speak.
Yeah, Shonda.
Yeah, so I have a question about the contextualization of images of violence, close-ups, etc. violence. Pardon me?
Introduce
My
yourself.
name is Shunandu Shannal. I'm an art historian, originally from Kolkata. I live in Boston. So, violence, pornography of violence vis-a-vis, you say, just use it, these the same images for different purpose. Since I deal with visual culture, I have to face this all the time. We are vastly outnumbered by the pornography of violence in terms of sheer numbers. So how do you do it? Is cinematic, like let's say in filmmaking, it's relevant to other mediums as well, those who work in photography, as you said, photojournalism, painters, etc. But how do you, what would be the cinematic strategy of a filmmaker in using the same images for a whole different purpose so that viewers are not, they don't fall into that trap of the violence of pornography of violence, rather.
Yeah, let me give you a concrete example. Because but I'm not theoretical. So I can give you by an example. I made a film called Father, Son and Holy War, which was...
That's the first film by you that I saw.
Okay.
When
So,
it was banned in India.
so very early in the film, I was filming in 92, 93, just after the Babri Masjid was demolished and there were riots in Bombay, so-called riots. And Muslims were massacred in the first, in both the phases. I filmed a street not far from my home in which a dead body, obviously burnt alive, was lying on the street, and the passers-by were passing by, not even looking, right next to the body, and pretending it wasn't there. And I got into trouble with the censor board, because the censor board said the rules say you can show a violent image, but you have to cut to a flash. You can't hold it more than a split second. You can do it, but there were actually written down rules in the censor board what you could do and what you couldn't do. So I argued, because we had to go to court for this. I argued that the reason that I have kept that shot for almost like a minute, or I don't know if it was a minute or a little less than a minute, half a minute maybe, is because it symbolized what the country was doing to the rise of communal violence. It was pretending that it had not happened. So these guys who were passing by the dead body without looking at it, and traffic was moving smoothly, symbolized what the country was doing to this phenomena. They were not taking it on. We won our case, and the film was allowed to be shown without cuts. And eventually we won a case against the national TV broadcaster, because half of my cases were against the censor board, and half of my cases, or more than half, were against the national TV broadcaster that refused to telecast the films. And we won all those court cases.
Would the rules still apply for photojournalistic videography versus?
Films are censored. Photographs will totally
Photographs, I'm
depend
not sure.
on the new.
Photographs. I'm like, if a film is in the category of journalism versus film is in
There's no category like that.
But
No.
it's a paradox that you can actually, if it's a national film broadcaster, you can actually go to court to gain the right to show it on the national film.
Absolutely.
And
This-
then when it's
is-
liberalized, it's the opposite. You can't do anything.
Exactly. You're right. Absolutely right. And that is the fact that we won 7 court cases, including 2 in the Supreme Court, to force the national broadcaster to show these films, because the national broadcaster kept saying, we can't show this for many reasons, whatever reasons they gave. And many of these films had won some kind of national award. In the days when the national award juries were not handpicked by the
So
party in power.
Doordarshan had a duty to show this?
So no. But we argued that the government that gives it a national award cannot say that the public shouldn't watch it. I mean, why you saying it's the best film in the country?
Award, then you could not have made this argument.
Pardon? It would have been more difficult. But the fact that the government gave an award, a government meaning a national jury gave the award, and the television was saying, no, we can't show it to the public. So you're actually treating the public like morons by saying only a national jury can watch it, but not the public. So we won on the right of freedom of expression and the public's right to information.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, when you said the 1 minute freeze, was the question is also about duration? Like the music video you showed us was about like 5-6 minutes, and your documentary films have often been quite long, some of them quite long. I was curious, like if in some ways, and say some of your colleagues like Nakul Swani, like Muzaffarnagar Baki, he has a YouTube channel, Chalchitra Abhiyan, and so on and so forth, because along with the state broadcaster now, of course, short video platforms on phones seem to also significantly matter, and we are again and again told that we are in a certain kind of different attention economy. Do you see in some ways yourself also making shorter, I'm not saying like 6 to 10 minute things, and I mean, do you think that's important today, because you often thought about circulation and distribution?
No, I've made many music videos. Which are music videos is just one way of calling them that, but they're just short 5-minute things. Not because that can get bigger eyeballs, because we're still
But you can still contextualize, since that has been a
no. In the sense that I've made both long films, 4-hour films, 3-hour films, as well as 5-minute films. I've done that always.
I think
for
he's
many
asking that now that I think what Rahul is asking, like people like Dhruv Rathi and others are now Ravish and others, they're on YouTube and they're using smaller forms. Would you also do now henceforth? Would you also make smaller
that still
films?
work with the kind of contextualization and recontextualization as well as your stylistic?
No, I would do both to the extent that I would do anything, because I'm not sure if I will keep making films. But if I do, I won't be restricted by. I mean, in many things that, because we are also part of political struggles that are going on, and very often we just shoot not to make a film, but to immediately show it that night well, now we have the internet only. In those days we didn't. But so, and by the way, when you talk about Narmada Diary, Simantini Duru was co-director and producer of Narmada Diary. It was not my film alone. But we, as I said, we've done, very often I've been using, even the films that you've seen now that are finished films, started out not like that. In Bombay, our city started out because slums were being demolished in Bombay. We were trying to help the People's Union for Civil Liberties and the Lawyers Collective to fight a court case for the right to shelter. We started documenting some stuff to help them, and then it became a film later. So many things begin like that and go elsewhere.
I think I've got two more questions, three questions. So I'll just, there's one there, and then probably, so just two questions. Yeah.
Sir, are you teaching filmmaking anywhere? One, and second thing is, did you ever think
Can
of...
you wait for the... we record it,
Yeah. Are you teaching filmmaking anywhere?
Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Hari. I'm a master student here. Are you teaching filmmaking anywhere in India or abroad? And second thing is, did you ever think of teaching filmmaking to these YouTube filmmakers? Not to the students who go to journalism schools or film institutes, but who teach filmmaking themselves. Yeah, the basics of filmmaking.
Yeah, I don't teach in that sense, but I've done lots of short stints. See, none of my films are funded. Whoever's seen my film will never see a list of all the corporate finance that goes behind the film. Almost every film now, if you look at them, there's a 2-minute credit roll that talks about all the funding agencies that went to it, and mine you won't find any of that. So I actually sustain myself partly by doing what I'm doing right now, by going to universities in America here and there. So I did one semester at Ann Arbor a couple of years ago. I did something at Macalester College before that. I did once at Stanford. And then I do lectures in India also I do this kind of thing, show the film and talk afterwards. But in today's context, it's not easy in India now to get a lot of colleges that are brave enough to invite me and have some do, but not many.
What about teaching filmmaking to
To
schools?
YouTubers?
Don't go to- yeah.
They do a good job anyway. they do. I mean, they could teach me, because a lot of the stuff now, in terms of camera equipment, it's become almost foolproof in the sense that these cameras are autofocus. You put it on wide angle lens and you shoot. So, and you edit on software that you get free. So it's not. If I'm invited, sometimes I do it, but it's not needed.
Yeah. My name is Disha Siddiqui, and I'm not an academic. I'm just here. So,
We need to give you a better microphone.
oh, okay. Is this working?
Yep.
Okay. I think you have a pretty tough job, because a lot of people who go and see these kind of movies have already made up their mind. They're already biased. And so when you go, for example, what's going on in Gaza and Palestine, if you see it from the point of view of the Arabs, it's something else. But then you see from the point of the Israelis, it's like they deserve this. So it is very difficult to get an audience who can be unbiased and really, because you do an excellent job. I've only seen that film of yours day before yesterday. But I think, how do you appeal, or you just show it and hopefully the people understand? Because that is why we have Fox and we have MSNBC and CNN. The people just are attracted to what they believe in.
Yeah.
So it is a pretty difficult job.
It is a very difficult job today.
Yeah.
It was a lot easier when we started out to get a big audience of all kinds. People of all shades of opinion would watch. Today, it's like a self-selected audience. It's very hard to get into a situation where people with different points of view are watching the same thing. And especially on YouTube or on the internet, it's self-selected. Everybody's watching. I mean, and your feed on your phone keeps feeding you exactly what you already believe. They won't give you the other point of view. In the universities, there's a little breakdown of that, and sometimes we get differing points of view. But even a place like here, I'm sure there's no rabid Hindu fundamentalists over here.
You might
Yeah.
be surprised.
Let's wait and see.
You might be surprised.
But
Don't come to our seminars.
exactly.
Though,
Exactly, that's my point, and that's my, there was a time when they would follow me around to attack me. They would come to, they would put their tables outside the cinema right here with the leaflets and how this is bad stuff, and they would be in the screening after the film asking what they thought were difficult questions. But they don't do that because some of them actually change their minds. And they don't want to risk their own cadre changing their minds by getting exposed to something like this. So they tell their people not to watch the films. My films get attacked a lot, but without having seen them. People who attack them haven't seen them.
But over here also, I think you should have had a much bigger audience than you have.
I agree.
I wonder why.
No, but it's not.
People
Yeah.
who are Indians, I don't see too many of them.
Eh,
Or anybody else.
we did maximum advertising. We can't go beyond.
Well, I mean-
That's what I'm saying, but why? Is it a mindset?
Well, no, just
We don't know the answer.
well, just as a practical matter, classes are on. You know.
Anyway, on that note, I just want to thank Anand, Arindam, and Rahul, and the audience, whoever came for this lovely conversation. And before I end, I just want to announce that there is going to be another film screening, another filmmaker coming, and another political film on Thursday, October 3rd, from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. There'll be a screening of a film called I Am Not the River Jhelum, which is a fiction film about it's a fiction film set in Kashmir in contemporary times. So if you have time, please do come over. Thank you, everyone.
I just want to say one little thing, that also, even though there's a self-selected audience, one shouldn't underestimate the value of even saying something to people who already agree. Because even people who already agree, many of them are totally depressed. And they're totally depressed because they think, this is never going to change. And I think the act of saying no, you don't have to be depressed, you have to do something about it, is worth doing.
Thank you.